Folks, I think we're going to start, if that's all right with everyone, and if people arrive, then we'll just let them file in separately and silently. My name is Katrina Mullen, and I've been roped into this by Simon Tinkson as a friend, also as someone who was a graduate of the TCD History Department a long time ago. I've since moved into other areas. But I'm delighted to be asked to introduce Marianne for a whole number of reasons. Marianne is the Professor Emeritus in Liverpool University with her track record. She's also got an honorary doctorate from the University of Dublin Trinity College. She's the author of numerous publications which look at both very, very precise and special areas of Irish history, but also broader cultural themes. And she has a new book coming out in October called Hearthlands, which she'll refer to in her presentation. She's also Wolfe Tone's biographer. She has done extensive research in relation to 18th century radicalism in Ireland, which I had the pleasure of reading as an undergraduate. And Marianne's work continues to navigate the issues that are part of our history but are also very live in the present, and I think that process of inquiry and that sort of intent to grapple with those issues is hugely important. The title of this session this afternoon is obviously it is what it is. I suppose I just wanted to say a couple of things in relation to my own experience of navigating those spaces between sectarian identities as someone who grew up in Derry in the 1970s and 80s, as someone who benefited from a cross-community education, and as someone who has worked in the space that is between identities and the barriers that they present right to the present day. And my work now is involved in chairing a research partnership with universities, including Ulster, Maynooth, and the International Centre for Urban Development in Boston. And we work on reconciliation through place-based leadership, through planning, through balanced spatial planning, social and economic and physical development being integrated in places, supported and driven by the people who live in those places. And I can still see how relevant the need is for scholarship of the kind of work, the kind of scholarship that Marianne is doing and others. It's hugely relevant at this time in our history on this island. It's a very sensitive time. And I suppose what I wanted to say is that in one way or another, sectarianism has touched us all, whether or not we agree with I suppose the attribution of sectarianism. It has touched us all. So on that basis, I wanted to thank Marianne and hand over to her.
Sorry I'm sitting down for this. I normally prefer to give lectures standing up, but I couldn't actually see my script when I stood up. There's no podium. And also I had a very nice PowerPoint for you today, but I can't see it and I don't know whether you can. So I'm going to have to, you're going to find that as I'm talking, I'm having to modify things because I was going to talk to the images. I don't want to pray for rain because that would be a real killjoy. But the consequence of having a nice sunny day is that you can't see my lovely images. I wanted to start off with a rather funny cartoon. It comes from the 1970s. And essentially it's saying that the subtlety of sectarianism in Ireland is the problem, because that you've got the kind of colonial military person thinking that all the enemy are black people because he's come from the colonies. I mean, essentially, if I can get anywhere, I don't want to take time over this because it's going to take time out of what I'm going to say, but essentially you've got the colonial general saying, can't we just kind of, line up? He uses the term wog, I think he does somewhere, which of course is a terrible term to use, but he's come from, you know, the colonies somewhere, and he says, well, we can easily identify the enemy, let's just all line them up and get rid of them. And the Irishman is saying, I'm afraid, sir, that the enemy isn't always easy to identify because we all look alike. And it goes on in that vein, and the colonial general says, by Jove, these Irish wogs are damned clever. So the point is that because we can't identify easily the other, we've developed all these kind of subtle ways of kind of recognising, and that was the point, and I just wanted to start off with that. But there's nothing I can do. I can't stop the sunshine, so I'm sorry about that. Now, sectarianism lies very deep in Ireland, not just in the north, and not everybody realises that it's there. It often takes the form of negative stereotyping of others, the memory of rights and wrongs, which often don't stand up when tested, and the creation and maintenance of emotional undercurrents, which can be easily exploited by extremists. These negative stereotypes were developed in Ireland at a time of heightened political and religious upheaval in the past. And in succeeding centuries, they were perpetuated by religious and political elites, and in time came to define communal worldviews and determine political outcomes. And we've heard a lot about that over the weekend. It is, of course, absurd to think that religious and national identities take primacy over other aspects of identity in human behaviour. Yet in modern Ireland, political identity has often taken a sectarian and negative route, and sectarianism always has a religious element, at least in the outset. Sectarianism was there before modern nationalism developed, and the political division of Ireland was the consequence of such sectarianism rather than the cause of it. If sectarianism hadn't been so deep-rooted, the Northern Ireland Troubles would not have happened. They happened because both sides acted as the stereotypes said they would. Now, sectarianism operates at many different levels, and people can sustain sectarian systems and pass on sectarianism to their children without ever recognising it in themselves. It has also stood in for class conflict in the past, and many people in the audience will realise how difficult it has been throughout Irish history to develop any kind of cross-community socialist alliance. And there's a good example of this of Peadar O'Donnell in the 1930s, the prime left-wing thinker in the IRA, because he felt quite strongly that working class identities would help him develop a bridge to Belfast Protestants. And he took a group of Protestant trade unionists to one of the Easter Republican commemorations at Milltown Cemetery. And he writes about this. It would be very funny if it wasn't so sad, but it is quite funny. And he said that when the police tried to block the route of the Republican march to Milltown Cemetery, he said that everybody on the march flopped on their knees and started to say the rosary. And he said, I could convince my orange friends to come to this, but I couldn't convince them to remain at what became essentially a Catholic ceremony. And he concluded that the Belfast IRA, and I quote, was nothing more than a battalion of armed Catholics. A statement which other people have made through the years. Now, of course, there are good reasons why sectarianism has been more blatant in the north, but sectarianism has not been as confined to the northerners as the rest of Ireland would like to believe. It's actually fundamental to the development of Irish identity. And let me try and... I have actually explained this in great length in one of my books called When God Took Sides. So you'll forgive me if I just have time, because really the purposes of this lecture is to try and explain how sectarianism is affecting the Northern Ireland peace process and an inability to kind of move on. But when you look at identity and Irish identity, of course the term identity is extremely problematic, not least because it has become a modern obsession and is usually based on stereotypes of what we are and others are not. It's this notion of identity that sees one side as ours and allows often the most intolerant and fanatical members of our side to define it and denounce as traitors those who do not accept the extreme definition. Atrocities are then explained away as self-defence, and the eternal sceptics will say, well, things have always been thus and will never change. And I remember people always... I've done some work in the peace process in Northern Ireland, particularly serving on one of the earliest international commissions, and people, even members of my own family, were very sceptical, saying, well, things will never change. Now, it's the fear of dilution or even destruction of that identity which produces excessive displays, often of its more extreme aspects. This cultural defensiveness, while more obvious amongst Irish Protestants, has been more long-standing and influential in Catholic Irish identity, developed in response to English and Protestant negative stereotyping of Irish Catholics. Secure identities, personal and national, tend to be low-key. And here we have this catchiness and defensiveness about our identity. We have the common traits of an inferiority complex. And in Ireland, insecurities have often been the backdrop to aggressive and exclusive displays of heritage and culture. Irish identity has been remarkably streamlined. The ideal type, the Irish properly so called, in the words of Wolfe Tone, were expected to be Catholic, and he expected Irish people to be largely Catholic, although he was Protestant himself. Catholicism and Irishness became identified, and that identity was moulded from themes of persecution and poverty, a perceived collective suffering and victimhood to which Protestants couldn't really belong, for they were deemed to be the perpetrators. Irish Protestants had much to say about such claims to victimhood and had a highly developed one of their own, drawing on biblical explanations to develop an entire philosophy of God's people perpetually battling evil. But Irish history itself came to be seen as divisive. Irish Catholics were indeed on the losing side politically for a very long time, but their version of history has had equal longevity, preserved by community remembering of wrongs and of constant reminding of those wrongs. Can everybody hear me okay? Because I keep moving sideways from the... Okay. Now, it's been such selective... Are we okay, George?
Move it a bit closer, that helps. Not better? Maybe you prefer not there. All right, move it. It's fine.
Okay, so Irish Catholic version of Irish history was the version that became Irish identity. And it has been, and it's the selective remembering of the wrongs and constant reminding of this selective communal remembering of Ireland's faith communities, which has shaped national identities and made the Northern Ireland crisis so difficult to resolve. Sectarianism seems very obvious in Northern Ireland, but less obviously it has underpinned identities also in this part of Ireland south of the border. And I believe, and I have written quite extensively about this, that it's far too early to write the obituary of Catholic Ireland, for national identity is still too bound up with it, whatever the declining power of the Catholic Church. You cannot, however, write about Protestantism or Catholicism in Ireland without also looking at both, for one was shaped by how it was perceived by the other, not always negatively, but very often so. Since Irishness became linked in people's minds with Catholicism, so Protestants were considered as foreign blow-ins, settlers, planters, associated with the big house and landlordism in the south and the Stormont regime in the north. In effect, both religious minorities in the south and in the north were all but expelled from the national polity as it developed over time. Protestant Reformation theology, particularly the Calvinistic brand which established itself in Ireland in all of the brands of Protestantism, demonised Catholics, thought them simultaneously threatening and inferior, a different species altogether, the barbarians inside the gates. When Orangemen said as much, their insults had roots in the Reformation, and while it did not always colour government policies, Protestants held power and much of the land in Ireland for over 2 centuries, and for much longer in Northern Ireland, and it often did. The resentful triumphalism of Catholic Ireland after independence and the resentful defeatism of the Catholic minority in the north needs to be seen against a history of being deemed and often treated as inferior, just as the sensitivity and withdrawal of Southern Protestants for much of the 20th century had something to do with Catholics' perception of them as England's faithful garrison, in the words of Sean Lemass in 1927. Irish identities to a considerable extent have been fashioned by such religious stereotypes. The negative labels stuck. We were aware of them and ever sensitive to their use, and as so many studies have shown, they often bubbled underneath prevailing good neighbourliness. Thus do stereotypical perceptions of situations actually change them to become as we perceive them. Even those stereotyped believe them and conform to them, looking for prejudice, even if it is absent. The stereotype of Catholics by Protestants, and one that can be traced over very many centuries, is that of Catholics as genocidal rebels, their priests absolving murders of Protestants. So all Catholics were thought by a significant number of Northern Protestants to have supported the IRA in the recent Northern Ireland Troubles. And random loyalist murders of Catholics had the same common thread: they were killing rebels. The word disloyalist was often the excuse for discrimination. But contrary to myth, the Irish are not natural rebels, even if they subscribe to a culture which extols those who have taken up arms in the past. This is not to say that some Protestant fears were not genuine, and IRA activities tended to underpin the stereotype of Catholics as genocidal rebels. Oh, you can see it a bit better. Somebody's looking up to me up there. But Catholic sectarianism is no less real for being less easy to identify. And the belief that they have been history's victims puts Catholics in denial. It often takes the form of post-colonial speak, Catholic native Irish Gaelic victim, against Protestant planter, settler, colonial victimiser. And in Ardoyne, in North Belfast, which is recognised as a Republican area, these stereotypes of Irish nationalist Catholic identity are told in a very simplified story in the wall murals, We have the story of this is just before the plantation, the O'Donnell and the O'Neill, the Earls, the flight of the Earls in 1607, and then their lands were confiscated and the Ulster plantation happened. So that's on one. You've got the penal laws and the mass rock and the supposed killing of the priest. And I can't see it terribly well, but you should be able to see, and my pointer doesn't seem to be working either, the redcoats closing in at the right-hand side. Now, this has been a classic image of the penal laws from the 19th century. It appears in all the classic books, in A.M. Sullivan, the Irish story, in all the kind of little simple children's books that come out at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. It's the most recognisable image. And the other walls have things like the famine, the Irish language, Irish sports, the hedge schools, the blind harpist. It's the kind of whole simplified story of the victimised Catholic Irish in the past. But the okay. Now, stereotypes, of course. Does anybody want to? Might be mine.
Mine,
sorry. Stereotypes, of course, have some foundation in reality, but they are stereotypes because they're distorted, and the distortions then pass as fact, shaping perceptions, behaviour, and policies. Take, for instance, the very long-standing stereotype of the Irish Catholics as an inferior breed, an untutored, herd-like underclass, disinclined to work, their priests keeping them in ignorance of useful science subjects. And it's been noted in Northern Ireland that when Catholics moved into an area, Protestants very often moved out, as much from the old fear of pollution as for religious reasons because of stereotype. It's a stereotype which kept Catholics out of government and out of jobs in the north after partition, and allowed Ulster Protestants to blame Catholicism for the economic backwardness of the southern state before the Celtic Tiger. Rescuing Ulster from the indolence of the bog barbarians became a standard justification of the 17th century Ulster plantation. The denting of this stereotype by the economic transformation of the Irish Republic and the rise of a new Catholic middle class in the north is just one element in today's sense of confusion and defeatism in the Protestant working class community. They hadn't had to deal with this before. This perversely is causing irritation amongst Catholics who feel that they alone were persecuted, they alone have been history's victims. Now, the ethos of the two Irish states after partition have been permeated by these kind of sectarian stereotypes. Swathes of people have fallen out of the national narratives because they do not fit the identikit. George Birmingham, who wrote under George Hannay, who wrote under the pseudonym George Birmingham and was a very successful novelist writer in the early 20th century, and was an avid supporter of the GAA, but because he himself was a Church of Ireland rector, he found he wasn't accepted, and all the stereotypes of the Protestants as planters were being said to him. And what he said was that in Ireland you could be a nationalist or a unionist without suffering serious inconvenience, but you had to choose your fold, and you had to remain like sheep in that fold. Anybody thinking outside the enclosure were thought eccentric or worse. It stopped you thinking independently. Now let's just kind of bring all of what I'm saying on to looking at the northern troubles and communal identities. A young person in working class Northern Ireland in working class Northern Ireland has always had to carry two histories in his or her head, usually his, because it was the young males who were the most vulnerable. One for school assessment and the other for the communal history to help him survive on the streets. And of course the communal history was everywhere in the neighbourhoods that young person lived in. Like this, you would walk past them every day. Wall murals have reminded polarised communities of why they are polarised in the first place and urged them not to forget. Those in Republican areas, as I've noted, told of the true Gael, persecuted and despoiled, and identified with the persecuted elsewhere in the world. Those in Loyalist areas linked Protestantism to truth and loyalty. The Bible at the top, the open... I'll explain this here, but the open Bible, the criticism of Catholicism was that, back in the Reformation, was that the church wouldn't let people read the Bible themselves. Protestantism said the direct access to God, so that's the open Bible, and then the loyalty, etc. Well, so the Bible, the Crown, truth and loyalty, that's all summed up in this mural, which is everywhere throughout Northern Ireland. And I'll just show you a couple more. The idea, in the past, Protestants have scoffed at the idea that Catholics think they were the only ones persecuted, and they have their own history of victimhood. Now, this is an orange banner about the Oxford martyrs, burnt at the stake by Queen Mary back in the 16th century, and it's one of the most popular images when new lodges of the Orange Order are set up. It's second only to King Billy himself. It's the most popular image. What does that tell you? I'm trying to remember what I've got next. Yeah, and this is one of the other images that keep appearing. 1641, the rebellion of 1641, when the Ulster Catholics rose up and massacred Protestants. Now, it was very inflated at the time, and it's one of the reasons why Cromwell acted so differently in Ireland than he did in England. The polemicists in Ireland were telling the English government that 200 had been massacred in terrible circumstances. And this is one of the images in Fox's Book of Martyrs, which became one of the most popular books in popular Protestantism. If you just look at it, just take a look at it, okay? And there was a kind of a sexual aspect to it as well. There's vivid descriptions of pregnant women being stripped, and the fetus being cut out of the womb and everything. It's very like that, Now, this image from Fox's Martyrs, keep it in your head. Can you see that? That's a mural that was on Sandy Row. I took this picture in 2009. And it was only removed in 2011, but it's still down. Now, just go back, and I think it says the Church of Rome, or Protestants are still being killed today or something, because I can't see this. And it's taken directly from Fox's Book of Martyrs. Just look at it. Part of the street history of victimisation in the past. Now, there are many similarities between past perceptions by Protestants in the Republic and the perceptions of Catholics in the North. Both were being punished for the sins of their ancestors. Both kept their heads down. Both were resentful. Both could only integrate if the predominant religious culture weakened. Growing secularism, of course, has helped the religious minority in the south of the border to do so, and the tumbling reputation of the Catholic Church is helping that as well. But we've still a very long way to go in the north of the perceptions of the Catholic minority. Now, every people develops origin myths, and the idea of a nation can be a benign solvent, bringing a common good out of diversity. The problem in Ireland is that there were two peoples whose origin myths have been based on extremely negative views of each other. And because these were religiously based, the clerics had far more power in Ireland than they should have done. Sloganising extremists looking for offence have occupied centre stage. The less extreme are effectively centred by such baiting, knowing that every incautious word will be pounced upon. So their own culture remained unchallenged from within. And the elites did rather well out of the creation and perpetuation of the sectarianised identities which I've been talking about. I want to try and come on now and try and show how this is all played out in Northern Ireland in the peace process and what we can do about it. What have I got? I'm just about to bring out a new book, and the dust jacket's just come through. I hope you've seen it, because I quite like the dust jacket. It's about mixed religion housing in Belfast after World War II, so it takes it from the 1940s up to the present to show how mixed religion estates, which were set up after the terrible war with full, a thing called the Housing Trust, was set up after World War II, actively trying to undo the wrongs of private unionist establishment in the north who didn't like the working class, even their own. The housing situation in Northern Ireland was just criminal. Absolutely criminal. I have the figures, but I've forgotten them. How little social housing was being built. And tenements in Northern Ireland were only being knocked down as we were going into the Troubles. And it's well known that because of that, because it was left so long, and the kind of, well, I'm coming on to this, but tearing apart old communities that very often were Catholic, nationalist or Protestant loyalists, and then sending them out to mixed new estates was one of the contributory factors to the Troubles. But we can, anyway. So I'm telling that story, essentially, of mixed religion housing, and it that's kind of looking from the other side of this particular state that I focus in on, because it was the one I grew up in. So even though I come from Catholic nationalist background, and this is now a very loyalist estate, I was able to kind of break into it because of what Katrina and I have been talking about. There was a shared neighbourhood place identity that overrode sectarian identity, and it was my way in, and I feel quite strongly that that's one of our ways forward. Pride of place and the people that live there, and your neighbours, etc., etc. Sectarianism in Northern Ireland, of course, is a huge issue, and it's unrealistic to assume that it wasn't present in this estate. And I certainly recall children's comments about silly things like inappropriate flowers in the gardens, Sweet William, London Pride, orange lilies, being very strange in Catholic gardens, whereas in reality they were in everybody's gardens. And I just remember the children going round and commenting on that, you know, and I noticed the little kind of, they're not lilies, but those little orange flowers, they're all over this estate. It was just reminding me. Or families whose adults were known to be sectarian, even though it didn't stop interaction and friendship amongst the children. Now, as I was researching this, I came across an absolute little gem of an author that I can't discover whether she wrote anything else. She's called Marjorie Allen, and she grew up in this estate, and she has a semi-autobiographical novel of what it was like growing up in that area in the 1940s, largely 1940s, just after World War. It's called The Sound of Anthems. And she tells the great comic effect, the little flashes of sectarianism and how the children negotiated it. And one of the funniest things in it was she tells how a little Protestant boy and a little Catholic girl, and they were tearaways, and they'd go up to Belfast Castle and, kind of stay there halfway through the night and climb the trees and everything. But there was this one incident where they capture the cat of a Catholic neighbour and push the cat up into this. And then a little, they were going to christen this cat. Well, what were they going to christen it into, And so the little Catholic girl was saying, but it has to be Catholic, because our Catholic neighbours own it, and of course he had something to say about it, and it's absolutely hilarious. And all the stereotypes as a child knew them were coming out, and then they just got fed up with it and went on to play. But it's a very, very funny incident. But for over a generation in this particular estate, and the estates that were built as mixed religion estates after World War II, for over a generation, Catholics and Protestants had lived, working class Catholics and Protestants had lived together as good neighbours and developed the kind of identity that I've been writing about, and I think is, one of the ways forward. Now, this begs the question, does mixed religion housing work? And certainly along with integrated education, it has significant support in opinion polls. But I have great scepticism of opinion polls. Because I find, there was a lot of oral history in this book I've written, that people would tell you what they thought you wanted to hear. And you had to kind of, But to come back, the integrated education movement, it's absolutely disgraceful that it's still only 7%. It only educates 7% of children in Northern Ireland. And I don't know what the percentage is down here, but the share, it's quite low, isn't it? I think down here as well. Now, despite my support, it's unrealistic to expect integrated education, even if it was more than the 7% of schools, or shared housing to fundamentally alter the canker of sectarianism, because sectarianism has been around for too long. It's in Northern Ireland's DNA. However, today, mixed religion shared housing is back on the agenda, even though it has much higher obstacles to overcome than it had back in the 1940s and 50s. And 94% of Belfast housing estates are currently polarised. It was part of the Good Friday Agreement as one of the aims that they were going to try and promote this, and it is inching forward very closely. But it only takes one political element to go wrong. Like, I'm going to show you, I've done an analysis of various opinion polls. There's opinion polls every year in Northern Ireland, and the analysis is quite interesting. I mean, I think I've got them next. No, I don't have time to talk about this, but it's a good map from the Ministry of Defence, because the area that I'm talking about, see if I can find it. Oh, don't worry, I'll move on. Because I can't really see this. This one's a better one, because the area I'm talking about is... Okay, it's there, okay? And things are still quite tense, because you can see there that it's a largely Protestant area, but this estate is surrounded by Catholic nationalist areas, and dissident republicanism is quite strong here. And the community officer has been very helpful to me. He said that sometimes they feel like the bullseye on a dartboard. So we're running out of time, so I'm trying to move forward. But I think actually, yeah, maybe I'll show you some of the opinion polls. Which one is that? Preference for mixed religion schools. Now, that is one of the most interesting, because, and I've got the figures if I can read them. Now, these dips are all, I mean, there would be an event, the last one, 2011, 2010, sectarian riots throughout the summer of 2011, and then you go into the flags protests, and look at the way they just dip in support. But it's terribly interesting because there's more Catholics against mixed religion education than there are Protestants. And if you actually, if you look at the statistics, people who say there's no religion, still they're culturally Catholic or culturally Protestant, and they still come out with the answers. But I think I'm going to move on because I just want to try and move on to what's happening in the peace process. Oh dear. Not at all. Just trying to see if I can get on some of the other ones that's the mixed housing, so the Life and Times survey. If there's time, I don't think we'll have time, I'll talk a wee bit more about it. Now, just to try and finish off, I served in a thing called the Upsal Commission in 1993, which wasn't government sponsored, it was supposed to be independent, and it was quite an eye-opener. It was such an eye-opener, because a lot of people would talk to us who wouldn't talk to any government sponsored thing. But I felt in 1993 that the Troubles would never end in my lifetime, and yet here we are. The Good Friday Belfast Agreement was spectacular in its vision and what it achieved, but I think we have expected too much too quickly. We shouldn't forget the damaging polity that it had to address, and I very quickly today have been trying to say something about, that kind of bubbling sectarian identity. We tend to be very critical of the power-sharing structures that have been set up, and they're certainly not good at following normal democratic principles, or at least appearing to. It is a sectarian carve-up, unfortunately. It was perhaps inevitable that the ideal of parity of esteem, which was in our 1993 report and is in the 1998 Good Friday Agreement, would see a sectarian share-out, which is what has happened. And we've had far too many elections, because elections do bring out the worst. They bring sectarian polarisation to the fore, and the statistics for the Brexit poll, Catholics voted to remain, Protestants voted to exit. I mean, I've got the statistics somewhere. I'll kind of and there's dismal findings are that sectarianism increases in time when the devolved government is in place in Northern Ireland, and they decrease when there's direct rule from Westminster. Tells you everything, really, that the politicians are... Now, the Northern Ireland executive for all these elections, I mean, how many have we had in Northern Ireland? Because there's been 3 or 4 just in the last 18 months or 2 years. The Northern Ireland executive had a new document last year called Fresh Start, aiming to implement the stalled Stormont House Agreement of the previous December, but it only has 2 mentions of sectarianism, as if they're trying to avoid, and those 2 mentions are linked to racism, and they're not entirely the same. I mean, sociologists might disagree with me, but I'm quite critical about this document and many of the politicians. I think the blanket criticism of the politicians is really unhelpful, but it's just a form of blame shift for what we really are responsible for. You know, that's what we have created. The 2015 Life and Times survey, which was published in June 2016, found roughly equal Catholics and Protestants, 86-87%, saying that they're favourably disposed towards the other community. So why do you still go out and vote for the most sectarian parties? And that is not asked in the 2016 survey, which was just published in last month. Yet housing in Belfast, as I've said, is still 94% polarised. How do you square that with them saying with 86% Catholics, 87% Protestants saying they're favourably disposed to the other community? And the PSNI report for 2016 tells that there's still 1,208 sectarian incidents in the previous 12 months. And in the same Life and Times survey of 2016, 34% of Protestants and 43% of Catholics are totally against mixed schooling. Now, what I found looking at that estate that I'm writing about, there's an integrated secondary school at one side and an integrated primary school at the other side. And the teachers are all very, oh yes, it's great, they're all friends when they come in. But I know, talking to people in that estate and in the area, that's very well. They were all friends in the estate, in the school. But that didn't translate into thinking better of Catholics or Protestants once they went back to their polarised communities. And this particular estate, even though they were at the two integrated schools, the children who had Catholic friends were the ones heavily involved in all the rioting. There was quite serious rioting, 2011 to 2013. So again, there's a big gulf here. So even mixed estates in education are only partially a solution. They're small steps, but we have to go down that line. And I feel very strongly that mixed religion estates, they did work once. You know, to go back to my original point that there was a loyalty and a loyalty towards the neighbourhood that overarched any sectarian identities, and I think it is one way to go. However, it does involve wider society recognising the issue of sectarianism, which isn't happening at the moment. Will we ever get to the point where we have normal politics in Northern Ireland, where we won't have good relations policies? Talking about the people we live with as if they're from foreign countries, it's extraordinary. The language of some of these documents, good relations policies for the people up the road. In the final analysis, in Northern Ireland, we're a society in transition. The Good Friday Belfast Agreement was a major and important building block, but we should be starting to think about the kind of society and structures that we ultimately want to transit to. And I don't see that happening at the moment. So thank you for, I'm sorry that was all such a rush. I thought I was ending with another nicer thing, but I don't think I am. Let me see if That's the mural that replaced the rather vicious sectarian one about Protestants being victims of the Catholic Church. So it's kind of idealistic, but if you look under it, it says, what is it, nothing without us. you can't form any policies without involving us. Now, it looks all very kind of cosy and romantic. Oh, this is great in the community, but the term community in Northern Ireland now is polarised. So they're talking about their own very polarised loyalist community at the bottom of the Shankill Road. It's still a nice mural, however. So thank you for everything, for listening. I'm sorry about the quality of the slideshow, and that the rain has come just in time for us all exiting this tent. And I didn't start off, I mean, this has been a wonderful weekend. I mean, Simon, the Kingston Inc. Incorporated is what I'm calling it, and the extended friendship, and because Simon is, I'm a friend as well, and the loyalty that's brought everybody together and made this such a success. Unfortunately, as I said to Victoria, bless Victoria, is that you're going to have to do it again. Anyway, only time for a few questions.
But time, literally, we've got 5 minutes, and someone else is coming in 5 minutes
George,
to do their time.
George,
so
Constance.
very quickly.
So, very quickly, Mrs. Elliott, you spoke about loyalty to local mixed area as a possible way forward in Northern Ireland. It's funny you mentioned that. I've been doing some research in my town in Northern Ireland, Lurgan.
Yeah.
And there was very much that in the 40s, 30s, 40s,
Same
50s.
Thing.
It was there.
Yeah.
But do you not think that the reason for it being there at that time was because those people didn't have cars, they had no capacity to travel, that in the town where I lived, the people I've interviewed saw the other side of the town as almost the other side of the world. And so that loyalty was kind of created practically. That community was drawn together because they didn't have the opportunity to move much further beyond themselves. And today, of course, with the car, the media, the internet, those are all, I would suggest, barriers to your proposal.
Well, I would disagree with you entirely.
Oh, right.
Sorry, Joe. Because what I have found doing the oral history of this is that people over a certain age, and I'm over that as well, roamed Belfast freely without fear. You knew other parts of the city. The public transport system was very, very good, whatever about the cars. But younger people don't even know other parts of the city because they're fearful of moving out of their areas, even though they have cars. So I'm finding, the contrast. And the one thing I would agree with you in the pre-television era, that when there was big things to celebrate, like Rinty Monaghan winning the world title or some of the others that I was coming across, it was pre-television, so people would go into the centre of Belfast. There was great festivity, and that has gone. That has gone. I agree with that. But in terms of kind of going further afield, no, I don't agree with that. But it's a good point.
We have time for 2 more.
Just a question about it, Anthony. You mentioned there the Life and Times surveys, which are pretty useful ways of categorizing. But what do you make of the significance of the increasing amount of people that are self-identified as Black and
Now I hear what you're saying, and I've got the statistics somewhere. I'm just trying to pull out my glasses so I can see you. Forget it. That isn't translating into a more shared idea about mixed schooling, etc., because because of the past, cultural Catholicism and cultural Protestantism is still too strong. I mean, I see what you're saying, and I have got the statistics, but we don't really have time to do it. I'll catch you afterwards, perhaps.
Hit yourself, and then we're going to wrap because the next.
We better wrap up, yeah.
Thank you, Marianne. I just think considering the glacial pace of reform that we've had in Northern Ireland since the peace process, what would you say is the most important area of social reform? Because I'm wondering, is it housing or is it education? Because there seems to be a certain pessimism that you communicate with these initiatives. Where would you suggest?
Oh God. if I had that answer, now wouldn't I be very influential? I think there's no big answer. We would have come up with it ages ago, and even when I was helping writing that report back in 1993, we used the term building blocks, winning back trust, because things are. I mean, the Troubles set everything way back. It just set us back so far. But I do think, mixed social housing is terribly important, and it is happening, but as you say, glacially. And the surveys of current mixed housing are showing that you tend to start identifying, just for self-preservation, your culture with the predominant culture of the estate. Like this estate I'm working on, there are some Catholics still there. I couldn't get near them and I didn't want to embarrass them. But it's very obvious, like the community officer saying to me, oh, in the recent Troubles, they were out, defending the estate with us. And I didn't like to say to him, well, yes, that is what happens. So effectively, the statistics that are saying, well, there's so many Catholics, so many Protestants living in these, slightly ignores that. That's why my key argument in this paper is we're not going to get to big answers until everybody recognises the canker of sectarianism. I gave an early version of this talk in Belfast in April. Big audience of people that, I knew quite well, recognised quite well, people from the integrated education movement. Not one of them would accept the fact that they were sectarian. Not one of them. They were standing up. You can't think... They're in denial. And if these were, very often, good liberal middle class, leaders of organisations, if they're in denial, how can they expect, working class people to do something about it? And so that's kind of, I'm getting a bit boring saying this until, and I've talked about it, I had to kind of recognise, it took me an awful long time, I thought I was liberal middle class, and I had to identify bits of sectarianism in myself, and I've talked to my Protestant friends about this, and we agree that you can't really operate in somewhere like Northern Ireland without having elements of sectarianism in yourself, as a form even of self-protection. Because unless you recognise the signals, you're going to kind of make... So that's my really big argument. But like if I say to Jeffrey Donaldson, don't you think you're sectarian? I know he'll probably, or if you ask him about the Orange Order or something, it's going to... I wish I had the answer, but the answer in the long term is that, we better stop.
Probably, I'd say taking a good look at ourselves and making places work properly for people living in them might be somewhere we can start. Thank you very much, everyone.